Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we would remind you to make that last courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off prior to our presentations. We will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage website for everyone's future reference as well. Leading our discussion is Ted Broman. Dr. Broman is Senior Research Fellow in Anglo-American Relations in our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He studies not only Anglo-American relations, but U.S. and British relations with Europe, the European Union, and the United States' leadership role in the world in international organizations and treaties. Prior to joining Heritage in 2008, he was for 9 years Yale University's Associate Director of International Security Studies. He also was a lecturer in history and international affairs for Yale's master's program. He currently also serves as an adjunct professor of strategic studies in the Strategic Studies program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Ted Broman. Ted?
Thanks very much, John. Welcome to Heritage on a day that when I stepped out of my apartment this morning, I thought would be a nice, pleasant, warm January day, but which has turned into a warm but somewhat soupy January day. So thanks very much for everyone who made the trip over today. In many cases, the events we hold here at the Heritage Foundation have a particular policy point that we'd like to emphasize. But sometimes we like to step back a little bit and simply ask some very smart and experienced people to share their views on important developments in the news and in policy. That's particularly the case when we're looking at something new and something that has the potential to affect the United States and the world in lots of ways over a long period of time. And that's certainly the case with the Trump administration's national security strategy, which was released last month. As one of our speakers today noted, quote, even many of the administration's opponents conceded that National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and his staff, led in this instance by Nadia Shadlow, Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Strategy, did work in crafting a serious and perceptive document ahead of schedule, unquote. But of course, that's hardly all that could be said about the new NSS. Does the national security strategy actually reflect President Trump's inwardly held beliefs? Does it describe policies the Trump administration has already undertaken? Will it actually drive policies going forward? Or is it, in reality, more of a window dressing kind of document? How does it compare with past national security strategies? What are the administrative, bureaucratic, political, and external barriers to implementing it? Are there points at which the national security strategy will rub up against itself? In other words, are there internal contradictions in the document, in the strategy, that will make it harder to implement and will end up tangling itself around its own feet? If this NSS is remembered in future years, and there's no guarantee that it will be, but if it is remembered in future decades, how will it be remembered? Is there a risk that in future years it will be remembered as the Bush administration's 2002 national security strategy is remembered, largely as a result of the comments it made on the concept of preemption? Or will the NSS that was released by President Trump be remembered more as a document in the whole, not for a particular point of controversy? We have a very distinguished panel here today to offer a variety of perspectives. Gentlemen with experience on Capitol Hill, the executive branch, academia, author, lawyer, practitioner, on all of these questions. Speaking first, and to my immediate left, Colin Dueck. Colin is a professor in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He studied politics at Princeton and international relations at Oxford under a Rhodes Scholarship. He's published 3 books on American foreign and national security policies: The Obama Doctrine, American Grand Strategy Today from Oxford in 2015, Hard Line, The Republican Party in U.S. Foreign Policy Since World War II from Princeton in 2010, and Reluctant Crusaders, Power, Culture, and Change in American Grand Strategy from Princeton in 2006. He has provided congressional testimony and published articles on the subject in many scholarly journals and online publications. His current research focus is on the relationship between party politics, presidential leadership, American conservatism, and U.S. foreign policy strategies. Speaking second will be Michael Allen. Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies, an advisory firm specializing in international policy, defense, cyber intelligence, and homeland security. He's held an exceptionally wide range of government positions, which I will merely summarize here. From 2011 to 2013, he was Majority Staff Director of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And from 2007 to 2009, he was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterproliferation Strategy on the National Security Council. He is a widely published author, including a book, Blinking Red, Crisis and Compromise in American Intelligence After 9/11, published in 2013. He received his LLM with distinction in international law from the Georgetown University Law Center, his JD cum laude from University of Alabama, and his BA from Vanderbilt University. Speaking third, Paul Letow, who served as Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council staff in the White House from 2007 to 2009. He had previously been Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. He is the author of Ronald Reagan and His Quest to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, as well as Strengthening the Nuclear Nonproliferation Regime. He is the co-author, with a good friend of mine, Bridge Colby, of the Foreign Policy magazine cover story, Have We Hit Peak America? The Sources of U.S. Power and the Path to National Renaissance, and with a colleague of mine at SAIS, Tom Mencken, of Getting Serious About Strategic Planning in American Interest. He serves on the board of directors of the Alexander Hamilton Society and received his undergraduate degree from Princeton, a doctorate from Oxford, and a law degree from Harvard. It's a very distinguished panel with a wide range of experience in writing, thinking about, and doing national security planning. So I welcome all of them to Heritage and ask Colin to open with his remarks.
Okay, thanks, Ted. So as Ted mentioned, the NSS actually got fairly good reviews, I think, from people, even those who are not generally sympathetic to this administration. The document itself was seen as a serious, in many ways, perceptive document. I will just note some of the groups that didn't like it. I think it's interesting. The People's Republic of China didn't particularly like it. The government of Russia didn't like it. Some of the most strict non-interventionists, on either side of the aisle didn't like it, and a certain number of liberal Democrats didn't like it. So that's sort of interesting to note. One of the most common critiques, even from people that did like it, was the question: to what extent is this the president's strategy? Right. So that's sort of the big question. If you go down the list of themes very broadly, I'll just list some of them that jumped out at me, and I want you to reflect on: is it possible that President Trump believes in these themes? We live in a competitive environment internationally. We're going to emphasize U.S. national interests in a fairly direct manner, maintain U.S. freedom of action and national sovereignty, promote U.S. energy dominance, hunt down jihadist terrorists wherever they live, a U.S. military buildup, rebalanced alliance relations emphasizing burden sharing and commercial reciprocity, and acceptance of great power competition as a fact of life, with cooperation where possible. Overall, the notion of applying counter-pressure against adversaries of the United States overseas. I think if you reflect on that list, it's not obvious that it isn't the president's concept. I mean, in other words, there's a reason that he seems to like it, which is it seems quite compatible with what he himself has been saying. So I would be careful about assuming that this is not the president's strategy. That's one of the most common forms of commentary you get out there. I'd be very careful about assuming that. A lot of the people who are making that case don't necessarily know what they're talking about. So I do want to reflect, however, on the past year or two, because, of course, we all heard what candidate Trump said roughly 2 years ago about some key U.S. alliances. One of the big stories of the last year, I think, that probably doesn't get enough play, is that this administration has continually reaffirmed core U.S. alliances, continually, in the Middle East, in Europe, in East Asia. So there has been a kind of evolution from candidate Trump's statements in some cases. This is a good thing. I think it's worth pointing out. But there's also a fair amount of continuity with these broad concerns that I just mentioned. Now, on the question of is it relevant, some of these documents are more relevant than others. There isn't, people who analyze these things don't don't really claim that any president could ever sit down and just consult it for granular advice in a given crisis situation. That's not how it worked with any previous president. And obviously, this president is going to reserve the right to act as he wants. So you're talking about a broad set of themes or priorities, which are useful and which can be useful, frankly, in bureaucratic tussles because it's a document that has the president's signature on it. That's what it is. It is a document with the president's signature on it, nothing more, nothing less. What that means is everyone has had to buy into it. All of the main principals have had to buy into it. And you can be certain that the staff brought in their feedback before writing it up. So it is not a meaningless document. It actually does mean something, and it indicates at least a kind of emergent understanding about some basic directions. Now, in terms of specific crisis management, specific policies, these have to be worked out in more detail. That's always the case. And actually, what you would want is for them to be worked out in a secret, classified way. That's what you would actually want, right? So, as a matter of fact, I don't think it's any secret to acknowledge that the NSC is rolling out a series of regional strategies. Some of them you've already heard the beginnings of. This is going to continue. So you've got more specific strategies that are operationally relevant without signaling to everyone who is an adversary overseas exactly what the United States is going to do beforehand, right? Which is how it should be. So in the end, you're going to want to watch what President Trump actually does, which is what you would have wanted to do with President Obama or President Bush or any previous president. But I think the document is useful, and that it gives you some sense of where this administration has been headed and where it may be headed in the coming year or more. Now, will it work? Yeah, we have 4 years to find out. 4 full years. Personally, I'm reserving judgment. There are some tensions within the approach, as in any previous approach, and hopefully we can go into more detail on that in Q&A. But I do think we need to at least give it a chance. I think there's a sort of common approach from the chattering classes in this country to really not even be willing to give it a chance. I think we should give it a chance. Let it operate and try to separate the signal from the noise. You may have noticed the last couple of weeks especially, there's a lot of noise. But this whole year, there's been a tremendous amount of noise. And by noise, I mean gossip, rumors of palace intrigue, tweets, counter-tweets, echo chamber hysteria, social media reactions on all sides, to be fair, right? Left and right, middle, you name it. It's a little bit much, I think. And what I would try to do to understand the fundamental direction of the administration, which is, I assume why you're here, is to separate the signal from the noise. Don't get too bogged down in the noise. This document may very well indicate a direction that is real and significant, and this is the signal. Think of it that way.
Thanks very much, Colin. Let's move all the way down the table here to Mike.
Thanks so much to you and the Heritage Foundation for hosting us. I'm Michael Allen. I just want to begin with complimenting Nadia Shadlow and those who helped run the interagency process that produced this national security strategy. I want to compliment the strategy. We hear so much about the unconventional and unprecedented nature of the Trump presidency, and that's true. But I think what will be remembered in this document will be that this was the sort of successful conversion of a number of disparate ideas that the president used on the campaign trail into a coherent document that will govern the United States policy for years to come. So I think they did a very admirable job. I thought the document was very interesting to read. I think it's to be credited because it also reflects one of the president's attributes, which is stunning frankness. The president, I think, called out things in stark ways. And, at the risk of being overly simplistic, to me, there are three C's that really stuck out for me. And that's contest, competition, and China. First, as I reviewed this morning all the other national security strategies, at least since Paul and I worked for President Bush, I think I noted different formulations with regard to where we were in the world. I think the Obama, if you had to sum up the Obama doctrines, I think it would be sort of rule-based international order, and they insisted that they led in a certain number of areas in their second national security strategy. And I think the Bush doctrines, or the Bush national security strategy, was certainly about counterterrorism, and naturally so. And it was notable to see how they dealt with China, which in the second term, you may remember the phrase responsible stakeholder. And there was another one about a responsible China in 2002. And so that brings me, I think, to the first point, which is the national security strategy, I think, formally ushers in the reemergence of the great power rivalry, a competition between states. And it calls out China, and it calls out Russia. I think probably much to the media's surprise how much Russia is in the news. But the president, I think, notes not only their propaganda efforts, but also their efforts at destabilizing. And indeed, if I could just quote from the document, that China and Russia challenge American power. They also write with regard to China that China has expanded at the expense of the United States sovereignty, and that these two powers aggressively challenge American interests across the globe. So I think if I want to sort of highlight this, it's that it rightfully calls out these two powers here, the great power rivalry, China and Russia, from an age of asymmetric threats. The second thing I think to mention beyond this is that this was very much, just the verbiage in it is very much about contest and competition. And we were complacent, and we sacrificed our military edge for, technology. We thought technology could benefit us instead of capacity. So I constantly see that theme throughout the document, that America's been complacent and America needs to come back. And I thought that was another powerful point. The third, and the one I want to spend a little bit of time on, is the economic coercion point that the president makes throughout the document. And that's mostly about China. And here I think the president is to be credited for saying and acknowledging something that I believe has become sort of bipartisan wisdom over the last, let's call it 3 to 5 years, which is when we were younger and we asked China, or we acceded to China joining the World Trade Organization, we told ourselves that over time we believed the rule of law would enable a market-controlled economy. It would enable political reform. And I think President Trump here in this document is very notably saying that didn't work. It may work elsewhere, and I'm a big free trader, but it hasn't worked in the case of China. In fact, he goes beyond that, and I think signposts for all of us, and I wrote an article about this, but I think signposts for all of us that the president is serious about gaining economic leverage over the Chinese. The way I see, one of the things I see from the first year of the presidency is that the president is setting up a number of items that I expect will be rolled out in the coming months with regard to trade, economics, etc. I think the president's experience from dealing with China in the comprehensive economic dialogue at the beginning of his presidency was that we, the United States, did not have much leverage. We have a list of hundreds of things that we would like from the Chinese, and we're unable to get much, and the president was unable to get much in the 100 days after the Mar-a-Lago summit. And so I think here the president is signaling to the Chinese, and in fact we've seen newspaper accounts springing from the national security strategy that there are huge lines of efforts with regard to China that are within the interagency process. I'll highlight a few under the banner of countering Chinese economic coercion. Coercion's in the document, and taking on China as a strategic power is in the document. But here are the things that are coming up. It's 301 investigation into the abuse by the Chinese or the theft of our intellectual property. It's about, and again, I think they're bipartisan issues here, it's about the forced technology transfer. If U.S. companies want to do business in China, which they do, that the Chinese will require a local partner and will require certain intellectual property to be transferred to them. A lot of companies we advise today are agonizing about, the greatest market in the world and whether to give up their intellectual property. That's unjust, unfair, and so they're moving forward on 301. There are a number of other anti-dumping activities. Aluminum, steel, semiconductors are in the offing, and even washing machines. So there are other manufacturing type items on the way. You've seen a more aggressive posture from the administration on CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which has turned down a couple of high-profile Chinese acquisitions. And I'm here to tell you that many more are on their way down, down in the sense of crashing or not being approved, even with strict mitigation. And finally, I would point out that, and I'll conclude here, that the Cornyn legislation in the Congress about revising CFIUS has real legs for all the reasons we talked about, which is that over many, many years, I think we've reached a bipartisan consensus that China is through their vision for 2025 and into the future, is strategically going about the theft and or the pilferage of our economic advantages. And so the Cornyn legislation is attempting to address instances when the Chinese want to use venture-backed entities, venture capital or their capital, to purchase some of our very hot and exciting Silicon Valley, or even on the East Coast, some of these corridors that do high technology. And I would commend to you a couple of items if you're interested in reading more about this. The last two reports on the China Economic Commission, I think, go through a lot of these China economic issues very, very well. And there was a report out of DIUX, which is sort of the experimental innovation unit at the Department of Defense that works with helps incubate startups by giving them a little capital if they have technologies that have a national security implication. They had a report that made it onto the web about a lot of the Chinese activities in trying to get around CFIUS in a variety of different ways. So you're going to see a lot of activity, I believe, not to mention the additional sanctioning of not North Korean banks, but Chinese banks and or entities who do business with the North Koreans. And from that, I think the president believes he's getting leverage. I think he set the table last year, and he rolled out at the end the national security strategy, which basically said we are going to try and combat economic coercion. If I had to criticize the document, it's that someone said to me recently, I think what they did is they took the Trump campaign stump speeches and then they, quote, smuggled in all the good stuff, the thing that Bush national security conservatives might like. Talks about we will keep troops forward deployed overseas, recommitments to alliances, recommitments to engagement overseas. So that's the space we need to watch over time, which is, the document is excellent, I think, from a national security perspective. I think we're just going to have to watch implementation over time. And I think, indeed, encourage President Trump to develop policies that cohere with this excellent document that was put out in December. So with that sort of highlighting of three issues and praise with a little criticism and uncertainty about the future, I'll yield back.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. And finally, Paul.
Thanks, Ted. I am delighted to be back here at Heritage and to help assess the national security strategy. Before I get underway, let me just emphasize that I'm speaking today solely in my personal capacity. Overall, I think the national security strategy is a thoughtful and clear-eyed document. I agree with my colleagues and friends here on that assessment. It has a fundamental theme, which is that over the last 2 decades, the geopolitical trends have developed in ways that are largely unfavorable to U.S. interests and power, and that the United States must focus now on competing, both in the short term and the long term. And in my judgment, as an organizing principle for the document, that is sound, and in many ways it's long overdue. Within that theme or that umbrella, it has some real strengths. The analysis, I think, of the nature of the competition, the sources of competition in the international environment, again, I think is sound, it's hard-headed, it's forthright. It focuses properly on rebuilding what you can call the sinews of our strength, hard power, economic and military power. And it also emphasizes and I think this is a new name or title, what it calls the U.S. National Security Innovation Base, which comes back to some of the themes that Michael was just discussing. 2 elements I think that have not received the attention they should. One is in the region by region section of the paper, it addresses the Indian and Pacific Oceans as a whole. So the region is dubbed the Indo-Pacific. And that draws on the work, I think the very insightful work of Robert Kaplan, as well as the classic geographers, going back to Mahan, Mackinder, Spikeman, and so on. And I think that's an innovation and a helpful construct to understand the region as a whole, which, among other things, is how both allies, friends, and competitors in the region view it. Secondly, functionally, the paper emphasizes what it calls energy dominance, by which it means the energy revolution that's been spawned really just over the last decade by the innovations of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, and the fact that the United States is now an energy superpower. That is something that when Michael and I were in the Bush administration, it was a great worry of us in the national security space, how the energy dynamics were playing out, and those trends have been reversed quickly, and they've been reversed because of American technological innovation and our ability to field those innovations, which also itself has an impact on environmental protection as well. So in other words, the U.S., we're actually cutting our carbon emissions, even as other countries are not. So I think the paper rightly draws attention to those aspects, which have probably been underappreciated in the media coverage. So basically, I think the strategy does a good job of clarifying some administration positions where there had been confusion. I think both Colin and Michael alluded to this. It sets a general direction for specific strategies and policies, which I think we will see rolling out over the course of the year. And it also sets priorities, probably better than almost all of the recent national security strategy efforts, which have had a kind of a kitchen sink feel to them. And this one is not. I mean, you will not find certain subjects in this strategy. And I suppose that's not because they intend to ignore them or set them aside, but because they're trying to set strategic priorities. Having said all that, I have 3 areas where I think there was a missed opportunity in this strategy, and then I have 1 real criticism. The areas where I think there were missed opportunities have to do not with the fact that the United States has to compete, which, as I say, I think is true and overdue, but that we have to lead, and the question of how. And the administration could have done in this strategy, could have spelled out what I think actually is their mindset, which is that U.S. hard power, our military and economic power, but also our alliance system, the forward deployment of U.S. forces, and our protection of sea lanes around the world, underpins the relative peace and prosperity that we've enjoyed now for decades and that we probably take for granted. And others around the world, in Europe and in Asia in particular, but elsewhere as well, it's slowly dawning on them that if that hard power, U.S. hard power, erodes, that the world can start to look a lot worse and quickly. And so I think the administration could have used this strategy to point out actually that while there's this emphasis on rebuilding U.S. hard power, that actually redounds to the advantage of our allies and partners around the world, also to those countries who have been chafing at the existing international order, but in many ways have benefited from it. Second, the strategy paper actually gives more attention to alliances and the value of alliances than some in the media have made it out to. But I think it could have developed more the idea of alliances as a comparative, that is, competitive advantage of the United States in the world. And then finally on values, and there's been a fairly substantial debate both within the Republican Party and between the two parties and in the world about whether the strategy underplays the question of values in U.S. foreign policy. Again, actually the notion of values runs throughout the strategy, and it comes up in some surprising ways. So one of the ways it ties together values with the national security innovation base is it says America's values as an open and free society and market enable that innovation base. But it could have done more, again, to emphasize that it's when American hard power is on the upswing, in other words, when America has the wind in its sails, that its values are most resonant and most attractive in the world. And to draw an analogy between, for example, the Carter and the Reagan administration, where I don't think anyone doubts President Carter's well-meaning enunciation of human rights and American, really universal values, but it was when Ronald Reagan came in and paired the hard power and the economic resurgence that those values really became more resonant and attractive. And I think the strategy could have spelled that out more. Here's my real criticism. The strategy addresses fiscal challenges in the United States. And it says that this will be a drag both on U.S. ability to spend as it needs to protect its interests, but also on economic growth. But it doesn't diagnose the actual problem. The problem and what's driving our debt and our deficits are entitlement programs. And that's to the extent that by the 2040s, every dollar of U.S. federal revenue will be spent on Social Security, healthcare entitlements, and interest on the debt. So every penny that the United States intends to spend on anything else, any discretionary funding, defense spending, intelligence, foreign affairs, federal justice, the space program, R&D, will be borrowed. And the reality is we won't get to that point because there will be a fiscal crisis beforehand. If we start to make changes now, the impacts will be much less severe, and it will be not easy, but it won't be difficult to address those problems over the long run. The alternative is to wait and have a fiscal crisis, which will be a genuine disaster, both for the people whose benefits will ultimately be cut and for U.S. hard power around the world. And the administration, probably for all the understandable political reasons that we all know, didn't point out that underlying issue. But in terms of an issue that will, in fact, affect our hard power down the road, entitlements is one. And I think I, for one, and others applaud the effort of leaders like Paul Ryan who've been pointing that issue out for many years. I'll end there. I think there's a lot more to be said about how this strategy paper was developed, maybe differently from prior administrations, and the difference between a classified process versus an unclassified process. And hopefully we can discuss that shortly.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. I think on the entitlements question, the administration has largely taken the line that previous administrations have taken, which is that the next guy can deal with the problem. Unfortunately, at some point, the next guy is going to be the guy, and that may be rather painful. I want to take the traditional moderator's privilege and ask a couple of questions, and you can omit or skip over one or the other if you don't really feel it's applicable. First, you pointed out, Mike, that the Bush administration's national security strategy were terrorism-focused, counterterrorism-focused, and understandably so, as you rightly pointed out. Where are we now with the war on terror, if we're still allowed to use that phrase? I think candidate Trump was, I think it's fair to say, somewhat reticent about the idea of U.S. military involvement overseas, except when it came to bombing ISIS. That's right. About which he was extremely enthusiastic. In some ways, the NSS kind of reflects almost an inversion of those two.
I agree.
On the one hand, now you have lots of enthusiasm for forward-deployed U.S. forces in great power competition, and to an extent, a downplaying, certainly not a forgetting, not an ignoring, but a de-emphasis of the counterterrorism struggle versus the return of great power competition. So perhaps one or two or all three of you would like to address the war on terror question. And then second, this is more an Obama question and maybe a going forward question. One of the great, to my mind, tedious phrases of the last 24 to 36 months has been the rules-based international order, the Rubio, as I like to call it. Where does the Rubio stand under the national security strategy? Is the idea of an international order underpinned by American hard power, is that sort of the benefits of the Rubio without actually talking about it, or is this simply a different conception entirely? Colin, Paul, Mike, any of you? Why don't we start with Colin and we'll just go down the row.
Okay. So Ted, on the rules-based international order, and you probably know what I'm going to say because we co-authored an article about this. It's become kind of a religion, almost a sort of secular religion to refer to this, especially in D.C. Think tank circles. Candidate Trump obviously was a withering critic of the notion of a liberal international order. His argument, I mean, right up to his inauguration day, was to say that trade policies, foreign policies, immigration policies over the years have harmed American workers. He was very straightforward about that. That's what he ran on. In reality, what this administration is doing, in some ways, it has pulled back in the direction of a reaffirmation of key elements of a U.S. forward presence. Not in every way, but in many ways. So that's important. And I do actually think it's perfectly reasonable for American voters to ask in 2018, you know, if this order was created in the 1940s, does it need any tweaks around the edges? I mean, is there any argument to be made that in the interest of U.S. national interest that you adapt, you adjust? My own view is fundamentally this U.S. order going back to the 40s has been very good for the United States and good for its allies, good for the world. But it's not unreasonable to at least ask the question of whether specific policies are in the U.S. national interest. That is not a morally outrageous question. It's exactly the right question. Is this in the American national interest? It's a perfectly reasonable question. So the first question should not be, you know, does this go against the rules-based international order? The first question should be, is this in the U.S. national interest? Now, on the counterterrorism stuff, there is a tension here, and there's plenty of good people in the administration who have written on it over the years. Actually, Nadia has a wonderful book that came out on governance in territories that have been recently militarily liberated. And it's a really outstanding book. And so she's very aware of this challenge. The tension, of course, in the current policy is what happens when you roll back ISIS? What exactly happens in those territories? Who fills the gap? Right? Is it Russia, Iran, Assad, Al-Qaeda? Or are there forms of influence under groups that are friendlier to the United States and U.S. interests? You want to make, I know that we have an administration that is very critical of the notion of nation building, and there's lots of good reasons for that, but you want to make sure that you exercise U.S. influence in ways so that the point of the war is accomplished politically on the ground, right? And so there is a tension there, and there's lots of good people in the administration who know that this needs work and are going to be paying close attention to it. Hopefully that tension can be bridged.
Paul?
Well, briefly, the strategy does have actually quite a strong paragraph on the necessity, utility, and value of the post-World War II international order that America created. And I think that's been lost in as Colin rightly says, some of the noise. And I think that was a signal that this is not an administration that, at least through this strategy, is inclined to abandon or turn away from that order. Immediately thereafter, it then says that this order requires some changes. I think that gets back to Colin's point. Again, I think the strategy actually offered an opportunity to link the two, that is, to link the hard power American and allied that underpins that international order, but it's there in a subtle way. On counterterrorism, I think that is an area where, and for better or worse, we'll see, the administration presumably made a quite conscious decision to say the theme of this overarching strategy will be the changing geopolitical environment and great power competition and the return of geopolitics, and counterterrorism is essentially priority number 2, but it is a prioritization. On the other hand, and I think Colin just alluded to this, a number of the people who, with the president, are steering the U.S. effort are people like General Kelly and General Mattis and others who have very long experience, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Asia, dealing with issues related to terrorism and related violence. And so I think that's a confidence-inspiring development.
Mike?
The first time, having worked for President Bush for all 8 years, 7 in the White House, I was very defensive when I would hear, well, especially when John Brennan said it in his confirmation hearings, well, we need to retool the Central Intelligence Agency because we've overinvested in the war on terrorism. And I just was a little bit offended. But now I think we can hold these two concepts together at the same time without being contradictory. We very appropriately, after 9/11, invested and dedicated enormous amounts of doctrine, resources, manpower to counterterrorism. We still have to do all of that while at the same time recognizing the reemergence of a great power competition. We have a lot of work to do in terms of resourcing, not only across the defense enterprise, but something I've studied very closely is the intelligence enterprise. We not only need to renew things like the FISA Amendments Act that passed the House of Representatives today, we've got to look at the challenges of the future posed by technology. Certainly encryption is right there, artificial intelligence, and I think the strategy is to be credited for calling some of these things out. Now, Paul especially is a scholar on containment, but one of the passages or the sentences buried within the national security strategy struck me as code for the containment strategy sort of corollary that we need not fight or compete in areas where we don't have a comparative advantage over our adversaries. I think that the document talked about how we aren't going to compete in areas where we don't have a decisive advantage. And to me, that harkened back to some of the Cold War doctrine about let's fight in an asymmetric way. In the Cold War, that was, was it propaganda? Was it third world conflict or whatever it might have been? Here, I think this particular doctrine calls that out. And they also talk about how technology enables strategic attacks on the United States without resorting to nuclear weapons. Strategic attacks against the United States. And so, the first thing that leaps to mind is, of course, cybersecurity. And so I think the document does a good job of not only saying, hey, listen, we've got to we've got to continue the war on terrorism, but also it starts to say, listen, we have new threats from great powers and new, particularly vectors of harm that may come to the United States through technology. But just for historical sake, it's very interesting. 202, the 2002 strategy, just to round this out. Here's a quote from it. America is now threatened less by conquering states than we are by failing ones. Whereas here in the Trump national security strategy, it talks about the great power condominium. And I don't like leaks, especially having worked around intelligence, but a draft of the nuclear posture review leaked online last night, and I've gotten a little ways through it, but the thing that struck me the most here was its mention of an unabashed return to great power competition. So this is, and comparatively less of the document was spent on the war on terrorism, although, as Paul says, it absolutely calls it out. So in a sense, it's the inversion of 2002, as you mentioned. And it will spawn all these subsequent documents across the interagency. The national security strategy will. And we're beginning to see that sort of signature in the new NPR, which so far is looks very encouraging to me.
Fantastic. Thanks to all three of you. I hope if we have a takeaway from this, it's the emergence or the reemergence of the idea of competitive strategies, which, as several of you have alluded to, was a Cold War concept, which I, for one, think is long overdue to a return to American thinking. And that certainly implies an element of asymmetric as opposed to symmetric response, but it's not simply limited to that. So with that small editorial, we have about 25 minutes or so for Q&A. I believe we have a microphone, yes, ready to circulate. Let me call on anyone with question. Please announce your name for the benefit of our online audience. If you have an institutional affiliation, please announce that. And as always, please frame your question in the form of a question. Thanks very much. Anyone from the audience who'd like to pose a question? We have a gentleman in the front here who I seem to recognize.
Hi, thank you all for some great discussions. Paul, you kind of alluded to this, but it's in the news today about how climate change is nowhere to be found in the national security strategy, and also maybe other public ills such as the lack of STEM graduates or obesity or things like that. I was interested in the panel's perspective on whether something like climate change belongs in the strategy. Thank you.
Would anyone like to take a whack at the baseball or perhaps the softball? Colin?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a whack at it. I actually think that one of the criticisms I had of the Obama national security strategies is that there was excessive emphasis on sort of fashionable trends and challenges that are not actually specific groups of human beings with ill intent. So my argument was, let's focus on human adversaries. That's strategy, right? So great powers, rogue states, terrorists. Climate change is real, and human beings are contributing to it. Having said that, there are legitimate differences of opinion, for example, between liberals and conservatives over what exactly to do about it. Is it a national security challenge properly understood? Is it worth paying massive amounts of money to address it? I think that's an absolutely valid question, and so therefore it is a reasonable position to take to say this is not going to be our top priority when it comes to U.S. national security strategy. And that's a clear shift from the Obama approach, and personally, I'm fine with it, actually.
It's a great question. I think it reflects, so far as one can read the tea leaves from outside, a prioritization issue, and a conscious decision that we will focus on certain issues, and I think they're the issues that Colin has pointed out, and not on others. The strategy doesn't ignore it, or there's a section where it's kind of woven throughout. Again, actually, in a way, it's a missed opportunity because of the developments and sources of some of our strength that this strategy is most aimed at, which is technological innovation, our free economy. The United States has actually done quite well in reducing its carbon emissions over the last 10 or so years because of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing largely. Not entirely, but largely. And again, it's a trend line where our emissions, by and large, are going down, and those of other countries, including some that are most public on the issue of climate change, are actually going up or are stagnant. So in a way, from a public communication strategy, you could say that it actually could have been an area where the administration could take some credit. But again, I think it reflects largely a prioritization issue.
Mike?
I think
Yeah,
everything's been said. I agree.
One of the interesting things that I noted in a previous job was we did a small study on the use of the word security and what foundations and think tanks funded and studied. And what you saw was that in 1989, about 90% of security funding went to very traditional, I will say Colin-esque forms of security studies, hard power by and large. By 1992, it had inverted. 70% of security studies funding was going to everything but hard power. And with a couple of notable exceptions, interesting with the Smith-Richardson Foundation, where one of the most important grant officers was one Nadia Shadlow, by and large, that pattern in security studies funding has continued over the last 25 or so years. It got to the point where we internally, Yale would say that anything, what's a threat to security? Are badly marked crosswalks a threat to security? Well, I mean, they might shorten human life, so I guess they are. And in that sense, I think the new national security strategy represents a very welcome return to what was frankly the American understanding of the word and the concept of security in the Cold War, an era when we actually really had to focus on it and think about it quite seriously. The gentleman back there in the purple tie had a question, and the microphone is right there. If you can announce your name and your affiliation.
Thank you. My name is Sanjay Srikanti. I'm a financial advisor at Morgan Stanley. Cybersecurity is one of the issues that really affect our industry, and I haven't read the strategy, but I was wondering if any of you all could speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can. The document does address cybersecurity, not only in the way I mentioned as sort of a strategic non-nuclear threat to the country, but it goes through some of the areas where we need to make progress, and that if you study the issue, you know very well. We need to be able to collect good intelligence, but that's not it. National Security Agency needs to do what they do overseas for the most advanced persistent threats. And so I think the strategy calls repeatedly for more sophisticated intelligence. But also it calls out that the fact of life here is that most of the malware, the vast majority of the malware, is probably in the filter at Morgan Stanley or one of these private sectors, because the banks are doing a very good job. And so what does that mean from a policy and legal perspective? It means that we need to be able to share that information not only with the federal government so that NSA and others might be able to go hunt overseas for where this stuff comes from, but more importantly, arguably, it needs to be shared horizontally across the private sector so that if we see a TTP or a vector at Morgan Stanley, they not only need to share it within the financial industry, they need to share it within the retail and the energy industries as well. We did legislation on this. It's an implementation challenge today. There are lots of good lawyers who I think very reasonably say beware of sharing information with the government, and it's going to be a cultural change over time to let companies and lawyers appreciate that the federal government will be barred from pursuing that information or using that information adversely, be it for regulatory matters or enforcement matters. And so the national security strategy calls all of this out. It's more or less bipartisan, by the way. There's not a lot of controversy. There's not a lot of differences between Clinton, Bush, Obama, and now the Trump national security strategies on what we need to do, especially with the private sector. We're ahead of the world, but we're way behind, and we can list, as you well know, from all these think tanks and other strategies. There's dozens and dozens of obvious things that we need to do, and we need to get moving on it in order to get down to business.
Yeah, just a quick, I agree with everything Michael said, and I think the takeaway for those of you, whether in the financial sector or manufacturing or agriculture, which is increasingly data and cyber-driven, is that the administration in this paper is calling for greater cooperation, information sharing between the government and the private sector. I think for all the reasons Michael points out correctly, that has historically been tricky to pull off, but I think the trend lines are pointing in that direction, so I agree.
Other questions? Yes, the gentleman all the way over there in the corner.
Hi, Travis Corson with Frontiers of Freedom. In light of growing North Korean missile threats, I was wondering if you could speak to missile defense, specifically in the national security strategy, where it's good, maybe where there are places that the changes need to be made, but what that role plays into the national security strategy.
Thank you.
Well, it's mentioned. It's not called out in an especially prominent way, but I'm glad it's there. I think, just as we want to reflect on the conservative movement in the national security sphere, all the abuse we've taken since Reagan on ballistic missile defense, that now it's more or less finally, a bipartisan enterprise that, oh, you know what? George Bush was right when he said we needed interceptors in Poland and the Czech Republic. George Bush was right that we need more ground-based interceptors at Fort Greely in Alaska and in California, because lo and behold, the North Korean ICBM program has progressed faster than the intelligence community forecasted. And so I get the reasons, and Paul's written a book about this, I get the reasons why historically people thought it was a destabilizing element to our relations with the Soviet Union, but I think we're beyond that, and we need to be able to talk about that. I think where ballistic missile defense is going to be is in the leaked nuclear policy review from last night. I know it's in here. I just haven't gotten through it yet, and I think it's going to be really fleshed out herein. And so I'd call your attention to that. It is unclassified, by the way. If it were classified, I would not be waving it around. As former government employees, we're not allowed to look at WikiLeaks or Snowden documentation.
We have an expert here on these matters, Paul, so maybe you'd like to chime in.
Look, I think that it is in the strategy. I agree with everything Michael said, but it's in an interesting way. And actually, this is one of the elements that genuinely surprised me. The notion of ballistic missile defense in the strategy is explicitly aimed at North Korea, and I think Iran as well. But there's then a sentence that says it is not meant to destabilize the strategic relationship with Russia or China, which is actually interesting because that's, for all of the talk that we've had here about the return of geopolitics and great power competition, that's an area where the administration clearly signaled this is not aimed at you. So I think that's noteworthy. I also agree with Michael that we will see, I think, in the nuclear posture review, in the national defense strategy, which is forthcoming, and in a number of the regional and functional strategies, a further elaboration on what the administration sees as its priorities and emphases for missile defense. I will say, having spent many years contemplating Ronald Reagan's views on missile defense, which go back to the mid-'60s, actually, and the initial ABM debate, which people forget, but took place during the Johnson and Nixon administrations. In light of what's happening in North Korea in particular, and the road that Iran, to me, is manifestly on, I look back in wonder at the debates at the time over whether this was a good idea and how fast should we proceed and so on. It strikes me that if we had, and actually we've made great advances, don't misunderstand me, and it's to our credit, both the government and the private sector, but would that it were even stronger now. So I think historically, looking at those debates, we'll be largely glad for those who were pushing for the systems that we have now.
I think we lost some time during the Obama years too, unfortunately.
Gentleman here in the front center has a question.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Heritage Foundation. One thing President Trump said that is a little bit different than Reagan or any other president, and that is, I'm going to do the best way I know how for my country, and you're going to do the same for your country. For a guy like me, I'm a Japan native, U.S. citizen, start thinking, well, does it mean it's okay for Japan or South Korea to go nuclear? I don't think he meant it that far, and I don't think Japan's gonna go for nuclear anyway. But so it really makes me wonder. My question is, I didn't read the whole thing, but can you guys talk about the allies, the importance of allies, especially in the Asia Pacific. Can you guys talk a little more about that? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe I could characterize that by saying, does America first therefore mean Japan first, or South Korea first? Colin, I think probably all three of you would want to chime in on this.
Yeah, and I'm sure I think probably all four of us here are big fans of the U.S. alliance system. So you'll hear themes repeated. But I think one of the main achievements of the NSS is to clarify that this administration views U.S. alliances as being in America's interest. So there is discussion of American values as well, but it's precisely the point that these allies, these alliances are reaffirmed because we think it's in America's interest. So there doesn't have to be a contradiction necessarily. In other words, I mean, in fact, the alliance with Japan is a great example. It's in Japan's interest, it's in America's interest, it's in the mutual interest of the two. So that's a reaffirmation. Where I do have concerns, I mean, one criticism I have is not so much of the strategy, but of some of the policies over the last year, is that there is a tension between pushing allies really hard on trade and then reaffirming those alliances strategically, right? I mean, you don't want to open up gaps that adversaries can fill, challengers or competitors like China or Russia or Iran. I hope, for example, that the administration can conclude NAFTA negotiations with Canada and Mexico successfully, or at least bilateral negotiations with Canada and Mexico independently. It would be a shame if that were to fail, because frankly, the Canadians can always go sell to China, and they will, right? So other countries have other options. So trade is a challenge, and with TPP and with relations with Japan, that's a great example of where hopefully trade relations between the two countries can be, as strong as they've ever been. But this is a tension, and it has to be recognized. So one point I would emphasize as a recommendation or tension or critique is, we've got to figure out a way over the next 3 years to, implement the president's understandable concern over the precise content of U.S. trade agreements, and at the same time fundamentally reaffirm this alliance system, which is absolutely in America's own interest as well as in the interest of our allies.
Paul?
Well, on the nuclear question specifically, one of the original sins of the last 50 or 60 years has been a failure of U.S. and allied leadership from the get-go to emphasize the danger of enrichment and reprocessing taking place within countries that are not trustworthy. Enrichment and reprocessing, as you all know, are the means by which countries produce the fissile material for a nuclear weapon. That's what happened in North Korea, with some help from others, and that's what is happening, in my view, clearly, in Iran. And we can talk, there are lots of reasons for this. The compromises that were necessary to make the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which in my view doesn't allow for enrichment and reprocessing under certain circumstances, but there we are. And I think what has been happening with North Korea and really the failure of a number of administrations, Republican and Democratic, to stop the nuclear program in North Korea is having a ripple effect, obviously, in the region. And one of the areas that should give us pause is what it means for Iran. And if you think it's less than ideal to have Northeast Asia involved in, let's hope not, potentially not, a nuclear race, imagine what the Middle East looks like. And this, I think, goes to the administration's quite proper emphasis on doing what it can without making the situation worse to try to constrain the Iranian nuclear program. But it's a fundamental issue. It's one the United States has been wrestling with for now generations, and we're now seeing the fruit of it in a very negative way.
Mike?
No, everything's been said.
Yeah. One of the highlights, or maybe the lowlights of the Obama administration to me, was the president's insistence that when the United States took action or didn't take action in one part of the world, people around the world didn't draw any lessons from this. For example, the U.S. could fail to enforce a red line in Syria, and this had no implications whatsoever for the way that we and our commitments would be looked at in Ukraine or East Asia. Uh, Many intelligent and sophisticated people offered a defense of that line of argument. I still found it fundamentally extremely puzzling and disturbing, the concept that credibility apparently has no reality. I'd like to close by asking another question of my own. It's been anticipated a little bit by your comments on North Korea and Iran, but I'd still like to sort of put it out there. Many of the difficulties that the Trump administration faces in American national security policy are fundamentally not very new. North Korea, problem since the early 1950s. Iran, a problem since 1979. Russia, one might, in my view, wrongly argue we had a bit of a break from the Russia problem, but the Russia problem dates at a minimum from 1946, and one could argue from 1918, or even 1917. China has been a source of vexation for American policymakers, fundamentally since the Chinese Communist Revolution, although certainly there have been maybe greater ups and downs there than in the other relationships. Does the national security strategy offer anything fundamentally new in any of these really knotty, difficult, complicated problems, which, if they were capable of easy resolution, would presumably have been resolved by a previous administration?
I'll in part repeat what I said at the outset. And I think China's and the economy is so important that it bears repeating. And well, first of all, in the introduction, they referenced Paul and Bridge Colby's excellent article about Peak America. I mean, that's a notable classic article already, and you ought to Google it and read it. I don't think there's a whole lot new in this document, except for, again, we are, and maybe I'm not enough of a scholar to realize it, but I've been paying attention at least since 89, and we have always proceeded on the basis that free trade, open markets is the way to go. And we've sort of backed away from that in this particular document. And while I support increasing our leverage and doing things about Chinese economic coercion, I am worried about how this will be implemented. And so I know that the implementation part we won't get into because it's not what you asked, but in terms of newness, I think it's a departure from the idea that free and fair trade is one of the most powerful things on earth. You want to talk about how you lift people out of poverty, that's how you do it, in addition to dozens of other unalloyed goods. And the second thing is that sort of attitude is applied to China, that it didn't work vis-a-vis the WTO with China, and we are going to take some serious action. I think that's a sort of a big issue down the tactics. I think that's what's new to me.
Paul?
I largely agree with that. I think and Ted, you're absolutely right. Actually, almost all of the challenges that we're talking about here, not surprisingly, have very long roots, and the strategy acknowledges that. It says that some of these issues are timeless and almost philosophical. One of the things that this administration has done with this strategy, which really is different, and you heard it here, and I think you've heard it in much of the commentary otherwise about the strategy, is the focus on ensuring that American power is sustainable over the long haul. And again, the degree to which it's spelled out why that is necessary varies based on who's speaking and in what context. But that notion is one that is new and notable.
It's interesting that if you consider the NSS in that light, it bears a little bit of comparison with President Eisenhower's concerns.
Sure.
Who was also very interested in the sustainment of American national power for a very long-term competition. I wonder if you could also say that the attitude towards Russia is a little bit different. U.S. policy towards China has been, I agree entirely with Mike's characterization, U.S. policy towards Russia has wavered over presidential administrations from strong optimism at the beginning to bleak pessimism by the end of the administration, in the case of both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama. One thing I will say about the Trump administration is they may have got through the cycle a little bit faster. They're on to somewhat bleak discouragement by almost year 2, as opposed to having to wait to year 6, 7, or 8 before you reach the bleak discouragement phase. I'm not sure if that's progress, but maybe faster learning, encouraged undoubtedly by events, is a kind of a progress. Colin, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that's a nice takeoff point because this, in some ways, this document is less rosy or optimistic than some of the previous ones we've seen. That could be a good thing. Historically, if you look at periods of lengthy, stable peace, it's often when people are least optimistic that they actually accomplish the thing. So maybe if we're at the end of the post-Cold War optimism, this is actually a good thing. We had, this is not to even criticize previous administrations, but we had a series of different kinds of optimisms, right, about how we could either have democratic enlargement or a freedom agenda in the Middle East, or Obama's kind of autobiographical excellence and diplomatic accommodations and retrenchment, and all of this was supposed to lead to a more peaceful world. It didn't exactly turn out as expected. The Trump administration actually begins from a somewhat less optimistic starting point. Maybe that will result in something good in the end. I mean, that wouldn't be completely unheard of historically.
I'm not sure if it will result in something good in the end, but I think we've done something good here, and we are at the end. So thanks very much to the audience, and above all, to the excellent panelists. Thanks again.